unwanted and unregulated fishing and destructive fishing practices, and implement science-based management plans in order to restore fish stocks in the shortest time feasible, at least to levels that can produce maximum sustainable yield as determined by their biological characteristics. Now, as you can tell from the goal and the target specifically here, there was a lot of technical inputs as well as the consultations at grassroots level to develop these. They are very well considered, very well structured, but at the same time would be very difficult for us to achieve implementation of. Difficult to achieve implementation of, but absolutely necessary if we're going to see perhaps fish stocks for future generations. If I move now on to the SDGs related to human trafficking, you will see that human trafficking and related issues, in fact, cut across a number of the Sustainable Development Goals. It is directly addressed in more than one, and indirectly addressed in others. Obviously, as I mentioned, issues such as poverty, gender equality, violence and abuse, corruption are contributors to human trafficking, and those are addressed in other Sustainable Development Goals. But here, I would like to focus specifically on Sustainable Development Goal number 8, which is on the promotion of inclusive and sustainable economic growth, employment, and decent work for all. Some of you who are aware of the ILO's work and FAO increasingly now as well will understand the concept of decent work and the agenda associated with that, but for those of you who are not, there is a body of work behind that. Under that goal, there are two specific targets I'd like to reference here, which is one, a commitment to the eradication of forced labour, modern slavery, and human trafficking, including child labour. A second is on the protection of migrant workers' labour rights and the promotion of safe and secure working environments. Now, human trafficking, forced labour, and modern slavery have increasingly become synonymous with one another. Human trafficking has evolved in our understanding and conceptually since the term has been used for over the past century, but it really came to crystallise in the UN Convention on Transnational Organised Crime in the year 2000, and I'll come back to that more specifically in a moment. Why do I raise the issue of the promotion of migrant workers' rights here? One of the most vulnerable groups to human trafficking for labour exploitation, are migrant workers. That's a fact globally. And so the protection of migrant workers' rights is reducing vulnerability to human trafficking. So, Sustainable Development Goal 10, is on reducing inequality within and among countries. And the target here that I would like to highlight is on the implementation of planned and well-managed migration policies. So you'll see the linkages right there of the protection of rights of migrant workers. Well-managed migration policies understand the needs of migrant workers in destination countries, the supply and source countries, the dynamics of how that may change in, say, 5-10 years' time, how to manage the labour needs of industries in destination countries and the growing industries in source countries, how to provide channels for migrants to access work overseas or even migrating within their own countries safely, affordably, and with the protections in the recruitment process and ultimately in their employment. And then on Sustainable Goal 16. This is a key one for the practice area in which UNAC sits under UNDP. This is on promoting just, peaceful, and inclusive societies. Now, UNDP's structure is very much around the three areas I highlighted earlier: society, and this relates to governance, the environment, and prosperity. So SDG 16 is very much about society, governance. And importantly, Target 16.2 addresses abuse and exploitation and trafficking of children. And it seeks to end all forms of violence against children and torture of children. Now, throughout the SDGs, it highlights the importance of looking at migration and trafficking. From the preamble onwards, the issue has really moved up the international agenda, and that was even really before the crisis that we've witnessed in Europe, the Middle East and North Africa in recent months and over the past year. There's been an increasing recognition of the contribution of migrants to growth, economic growth, and to societies in their destination countries and in source countries. And I'd also like to highlight here SDG 17, which provides the means of implementation for the other 16 goals. It looks at implementing a framework, providing the financing, or the means to financing, at least, for the achievement of the goals. And it establishes the importance of measuring progress and for collecting data. It's a huge undertaking, collecting data against these goals and targets. But without that measurement, these will not be achieved. To measure the number of people who are trafficked globally is going to be very difficult in and of itself. It's a hidden crime. There have been some efforts estimates, which I will go into in a moment. But this is what the governments are committed to. And also, breaking down the numbers, the indicators, into specific groups. So looking at gender, looking at the proportion of males and females, for example, in poverty, with access to decent work, being trafficked and so on. Not just by sex, but also by age, by race and ethnicity. And importantly, it recognises also by migratory status, by those who are in their home countries, by those who are in destination countries, whether on a permanent basis, on a temporary basis, or in forced labour conditions, perhaps. So let's move on to the issue of IUU fishing now. I highlighted at the beginning that it is a major global threat to sustainable fisheries management. It is a threat to food stocks. It is a threat to communities as a result of that. It's a threat to livelihoods for those who are dependent on fish for their families, for their communities. And it's also a threat to national economies. That's been recognised much more clearly in the past couple of years because it affects trade, it affects reputation, as much as it does the immediacy of access to fish at sea. In the longer term, of course, the threat to 2 billion plus people really should help us remain on target. It's also important to recognise that IUU fishing is often committed by those who have no interest in preserving fish stocks. They will use equipment and gear which is extremely harmful to the has witnessed the need for boats going out further and further to sea because of the depletion of fish stocks in some areas. But I will come on to some of the impressive work that has been done to try and address that now. I believe some of the presenters later will also discuss that in much greater depth. But it's a global problem. It's a huge industry. The estimates are that up to $23 billion are made annually from illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing. There were estimates of IU fishing in the US markets, much of that coming from international but also national supply, and that in itself was over 20% of the fish entering markets, which were deemed to be among the most transparent and sustainable among the countries of the world. So the challenge is quite daunting. It's difficult to address for many issues, which I believe a number of you here have been working on. The issue of the cross-border nature of the supply chains, the complexity of supply chains, the issue of the catch being made often in seas of countries or internationally different from those that the catch is being brought into, the transshipment of catch at sea from one boat to another, the paper documentation that is intended to represent a trail for traceability and transparency is often easily defrauded, allowing for laundering of essentially illegal fish catch to become seen as legal. But there are some real positive measures that are now being taken against this. In the US, at the level of a presidential task force in the past couple of years, there have been some great gains in recognition of the scale of the problem, setting out a bold and ambitious plan at that level to address illegal fishing, with 15 recommendations being made and pursued, an implementation plan in place to address illegal fishing entering supply chains, and to improve capacities internationally, also through diplomatic efforts at the high level to try to address this problem. A couple of years ago, the Indonesian government, in another venture, as many of you will know, introduced a moratorium on the illegal fishing and the activities of foreign-owned vessels in Indonesian waters, recognizing that marine life, fish, were absolutely crucial to Indonesia's national security. There have been a lot of illegal fishing in Indonesia, and when they undertook this moratorium, they found that close to 100% of international vessels from other countries, were fishing illegally. They were often working in joint ventures or under flags of convenience, or sometimes they would just be accompanying vessels that were registered and were able to then move around and avoid detection. The action that Indonesia has taken in some small respects have been considered controversial, but the impacts have been great. They have seen a drop in illegal fishing to over a 90% decline, and that is just one aspect of the action plan that we put in place. There has been substantial action across ministries, which is ongoing and in fact increasing. In Thailand, we've seen some great progress in terms of the IU roadmap, the establishment of the CCCIF to combat illegal fishing at sea, the introduction of the port in, port out measures, the revision of the Fisheries Act. There has been a great momentum now developed in Thailand in progress against illegal fishing, recognising all of these different issues that contribute to insecurity and will have an impact on coastal communities, the economy, and so forth. An important agreement internationally which has just come into effect because of the number of countries which have ratified it, including Thailand, is the Port State Measures Agreement. Now this has the potential of reducing hugely the access to ports and markets of illegal fishing. It prevents illegal fishing from entering supply chains in those countries that have signed up and ratified this agreement. 60 countries have so far, and 60 countries and parties. The EU is just one single party to that. So we have Myanmar, Thailand, Korea, and some of the Pacific states already signed up to that in this region. Once all of the states have signed up to that, all foreign fishing vessels coming to dock in the country will be monitored and registered. That's from refueling to offloading fish as well. Now let me move quickly onto the issue of human trafficking, something which I normally speak at length about, but I will just touch on a bit here because of the interconnection with the issue at hand. Human trafficking often implies to people movement. It's often synonymous with smuggling in other areas, such as drug smuggling, arms smuggling, synonymous with drug trafficking, arms trafficking. This is very different when it's people involved. Because of the UN Convention on Transnational Organised Crime, the government agreed people smuggling was about movement across borders irregularly, informally, without documentation. Human trafficking does not need movement across borders, nor does it ultimately require movement. It is defined as having three components: an act, a means, and a purpose. But it is the purpose that we are most focused on. And the purpose could be for forced labour, servitude, slavery-like practices, forced prostitution, and a number of other destinations, endpoints. But if you find someone in a situation of forced labour, you can guarantee that the act and the means will be present. They will have been recruited at some point, or harboured, or transported. The means will be present. They will have been forced, or coerced, or deceived into that situation. It may not have happened initially. In the fisheries industry, you or I can voluntarily go onto a fishing boat to work on the understanding of how much we're going to be paid, when we're going to get paid, when we would finish our time on that fishing boat. When those terms are broken, we aren't paid when we were told, we're on that boat longer than we expected, we may experience violence. And if we can't get off that boat then we are essentially in forced labour on that fishing boat. That happens to a lot of people. For others, they can be tricked directly from their home villages. They can be tricked from a bus station to go to a karaoke or an entertainment venue by a broker who's hanging out at the train station or bus station. Pour some drinks, wake up in the morning with a huge bill they can only pay off by going to work on the boat associated with that middleman broker and ultimately the captain they're connected to. And that happens. I've interviewed people that that's happened to, and across the spectrum of experiences. There's been a lot of focus on Thailand in the past couple of years for trafficking onto fishing boats, but we also observe, respond to cases in Korea, in New Zealand, in the UK, in Scotland, Ireland, and also around Africa, West Africa, Somalian waters, South Africa. It's a global problem. Fishing boats go globally in search of catch, and particularly those that are involved in IUU fishing. In the populations at risk are often the most vulnerable. There are a lot of vulnerable people in this region, and that is why perhaps the issue of trafficking on fishing boats has become so exacerbated and entrenched. Now let me just quickly scan through some of the action that's taken against human trafficking. I've mentioned the UN Convention, been ratified by many countries around the world. Thailand's law is aligned to the UN Convention, and there are plans and policies and committees in place in Thailand to take very strong action against human trafficking. There is recognition of some of the progress that has been made, particularly in terms of victim protection structures, but also recognition of the progress which is yet to be made. And given the time here, I won't touch too much further on the overlap between tip and IU fishing, but I think that I've highlighted some of that already. The labour conditions which are experienced on boats, which don't report, which aren't monitored, are often also those boats which engage in illegal and unreported fishing. They often fish in waters where they can avoid detection, but migrant workers on these boats, even where they are encountering authorities, often aren't being either interviewed by authorities or even being suspected of being victims of trafficking. The authorities cannot interview them because they don't speak the same languages, they don't suspect that the documentation that they're holding is fraudulent, and there's no other way for them to know unless integrated action is taken against IU and TIP, and within the authorities' mandates that encounter fishing boats at sea, at docks where boats fishing internationally come into either refuel, restock, or offload their fish. Unless integrated action takes place across those areas, we aren't going to be able to address this problem. I'll quickly flick past the complexities in the supply chains, but there are many vulnerable points. I mentioned the transshipment, but also at ports and with middlemen, in which fish brought from boats that conduct legal fishing and legal fishing are combined and then ultimately become one. So then let me quickly just finish off on the needs. I've just recited some of the significant problems we face, the structures which we now have in place through the political will of Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. What do we need right now to be able to start achieving this? We need political will at the highest levels and throughout government. That's a big ask, but that's already been committed to at the tops of government. It's something which we all have a stake in. We all have a stake in the security of our communities, our countries, and the international community, for ourselves, our families, and for generations to come. We require national ownership of the SDGs. As I mentioned, it really is incumbent on the national governments themselves to set ambitious targets, make sure they collect data to achieve those targets. Without the data, it won't be measured, it won't be achieved. It requires the governments, because the governments have the power to do this, to work with civil society, to work with the private sector to move towards these goals. It requires some hard decisions in those relationships. It's going to affect perhaps issues of trade, reducing tariffs perhaps for some preferred industries and partners. But it will create a level playing field that is sustainable. It requires long-term development partnerships, and the UN stands ready to support this. Not just UNDP, where I come from, but those of you working in illegal fishing and tipping fisheries will know that the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, the ILO, the International Labour Organization, which are other agencies of the UN, are all working towards this same agenda as well. And ultimately, just one note from my agency's perspective, it also requires support to those who have been affected by trafficking into, whether it's the fishing industry, agriculture, construction, manufacturing, domestic work, sexual servitude. It requires support services to be provided to them so that they can successfully integrate back into their societies and communities and not be re-trafficked again into these vulnerable sectors. With that, I'd like to thank you all very much for your attention, to the organisers for allowing me to speak with you today, and I wish you a very successful conference here today. Thank you very much.